Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology. Hello, everybody. This is Seth from the world of paleoanthropology, and today we have a great new guest, a wonderful author. I would like to introduce him now. Mr. Henry G., how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Seth. Thanks for inviting me on.
It is very good to have you. I've been waiting for this meeting for quite some time. Your book has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for including me in your early readings of it. It has been truly a book I can't put down.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about, first of all, what is this book I'm speaking of, and what was your motivation behind it?
A long time ago, I had at the back of my mind a little idea to write a little book about life on Earth. I call it Henry's Book of Life on Earth, something very simple, because at Nature, I've been there for nearly 34 years, and I've been personally involved in in the publication of some great fossils. I've nurtured to publication fossils and other great things from the whole of the range of the history of life. But as with all great ideas, it kind of went to the back of my mind and stayed there. You know how things are with old tennis rackets and barbecues that you can't get out because it's always raining and other junk. So it didn't come to the surface. And then what happened was, while I was at Nature, I would go and interrupt my colleagues in the news department. And one of my colleagues in the news department was a guy called David Adam, who's moved on, and he'd written a couple of books on psychology. And we chat about books and our latest works in progress. And I just finished a book, a very technical book on the origin of vertebrates, which is a kind of hobby of mine. David asked me what I was working on. I said, I'm not going to write another expletive book. I'm really not going to write it. And David ignored me and said, why don't you write a book about all these amazing fossils you've nurtured into publication over the years? And so, still protesting I wasn't going to write the expletive book, I wrote the expletive book. So to anybody who's out there who doesn't like the book, don't blame me, blame David Adam. It's all his fault. So to cut a long story short, that's how it happened. But of course, I wrote the whole expletive book in a rather different way from the way it came out. And I sent it to my marvelous agent, Jill Grinberg, Literary Management. Every author should have an agent who's worked with me for more than 20 years now. And she chivied the book and the ideas into the marvelous form that you see it now. So really, it's all the good bits are because of Jill and her advice. We just turned it into basically the book that I had at the back of my mind all those years ago, a very simple history of life. As one German fellow reputedly said about his autobiography, in the beginning, I have the beginning of my life. At the end, I have the end of my life. And in the middle, I have the time of my life. So that's what it is. And I've just seen the copy that's come out in the US, or it's coming out in about 5 short sleeps away from when we're recording. It's coming out on the 9th. And it is very small. It's much smaller than the US edition. You can hold the whole of the history of life in the palm of your hand. They've made it into this beautiful small book that you can hold put in a pocket for dipping into during those small moments of downtime that inevitably happen in the day, like waiting for a bus or queuing for your COVID vaccine or waiting for the kids to come out of school. And so I'm amazed that they made it, and they didn't leave anything out. I thought, crikey, this book's very small. The UK volume is much bigger, but it's still got the same stuff in it. So it really is a very short history of life on Earth. I hadn't seen the finished copy till yesterday, although my friends and colleagues in the US had seen it some time ago, and they all kept asking me, how did I manage to get so much into such a tiny book? And now I understand why they're asking the question. Ruthless editing, that is the answer.
And you know, it definitely worked in your favor, because I gotta say, when you're reading it, the sensation that I get is that you're sitting in a time machine that just has a window,
Mm,
and you're literally just sitting there watching time from the very beginning of your book go all the way through, and you explain things so eloquently and in such a way that it's not, you don't have to think about what you're saying. You just say it and you just read it, and it just flows through, and it's like just watching time go by. And the editing and what's included and the way it's included, I think, could not have been more on point.
thank you.
It's
Thank you
just
very much.
fantastic.
Thank you. It comes from a great deal of practice. So I've been writing books. Well, I wrote my PhD thesis. You know what that's like. And after I finished my PhD thesis, I couldn't bear not writing a book. I went straight from graduate school into nature. I just fell into it by some strange set of circumstances. And ever since then, I've been writing books. So whenever I say to my wife, I'm not going to write another expletive book, dear, she just looks at me with a knowing smile and knows that sooner or later I'll be writing another book. So I've been doing this for a while, and what you find if you're a writer is you just got to keep practicing at it, and eventually you get better. And it's always very good having really good colleagues you can trust, you know, my agent, and of course I have a lot of friends and colleagues in academia who were very gave their time to read it. And I've dedicated the book to one of my colleagues, Jenny Clack, who died recently of cancer. She, when I was at graduate school, she helped me through a very sticky patch in my life. I used to be a fly, and even in her last illness, she sent very cheerful, chatty comments to me on the bits that she knew about, which was the movement of tetrapods onto land. So one result of my being at nature for all this time is I was able to call on a great deal of expertise of people all the way around the world who'd be able to pull me up on things, although of course all the mistakes are mine, and there's quite a lot of stuff where I am, in technical terms, relying more or less on evidential support, or in non-technical terms, having to make shit up because nobody knows what went on, particularly about the origin of life. And of course, near the end, the book's subtitled 4.6 billion years in 12 pithy chapters. I have hard time saying pithy because I've lost a lot of teeth. But I actually give you a free extra billion near the end. So that's free. You get that for nothing. You just pay for the 4.6 billion and I give you another billion. I just chuck that one in, which was completely making shit up, trying to work out what life might be like between now and the end of life on Earth, which will be in a billion years time or so, based on various calculations about how hot the sun's going to be and so on. But yeah, I'm amazed I managed to get into such a small space. I mean, I've looked at the edition and the print isn't tiny. I mean, I have had an eye test recently, so on some, but I'm quite pleased with the way it's turned out on the whole.
Most definitely. I mean, it definitely is, I've got to say, one of my favorite science books I've ever read. It truly is. I know I keep complimenting it, but it's that good. People really need to read this. And so the one thing that comes to my mind is, what is your favorite time period that you write about?
Well, I've learned a lot about the history of life while writing this book. And I think my favorite time period has to be the Triassic. The Triassic period, a 50 million year period that was just before the famous Jurassic period. So I've got a chapter in it called Triassic Park. Now, the Triassic period is usually only known as the period in which the dinosaurs evolved towards the end of the Triassic. And I found out a lot about that in my friend Steve Brusati's fabulous book, The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. But also in another book by a friend of mine called Nick Fraser, which is called Dawn of the Dinosaurs, but it's actually about the Triassic, and it's got fantastic illustrations by Doug Henderson. And I only got this book, I had to get it secondhand through a book dealer. It's not really available. And this is a great shame. I think because the dinosaurs get all the attention, the Triassic doesn't really get the attention it deserves. It was at the same time modern and ancient. Many modern groups originated in the Triassic. It would be lovely to go back and look at the earliest mammals and the earliest turtles and the earliest frogs, but also there are a lot of weird creatures that only lived in the Triassic. There were lots of marine reptiles, thalattosaurs and placodonts and other nothosaurs, only known from the Triassic. And there were also some incredibly weird things like Charavipteryx, a flying reptile that had membranes between its hind legs, not its front legs, and the Drepanosaurs, which were completely crazy mixtures of birds' heads and sloths' bodies with claws on each leg and the tail. So, and then there was Tanystropheus that was several meters long. It was called a prolace certiform, I think, but most of its body length was its neck, and its neck had long, very stiff vertebrae. So goodness knows what it was doing. Oh, and there were the first pterosaurs. It would be nice to go. Now, here's a big mystery in paleoanthropology that I'd love to see solved one day, is that nobody has any kind of morphological intermediate between pterosaurs and not pterosaurs. There's a recent paper, there's a couple of recent papers. One was in Nature about Lagerpetids, which one of these reptiles, these archosaurian reptiles, of which there are many different sorts in Triassic, that had certain little features in its limbs and ear that were reminiscent of pterosaurs, but they were definitely land-living creatures. So it would be nice to see if you could try and find the origin of pterosaurs from non-flying creatures and try and work out the evolution and also the aerodynamics of early pterosaurs, because the first pterosaurs appear fully formed in the Triassic. I mean, they are quite primitive. They've got lots of teeth and they're not as streamlined and efficient as the later ones, but they're still flying animals. So the Triassic, I think I'm going to, you heard it first here. I'm standing up for the Triassic period. Let's have more of it. There's so much incredible, amazing diversity of life. And another thing about the Triassic, it exemplifies a theme of the book, which is if life had a motto, it would be whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Because the Triassic happened after the Permian catastrophe, where almost all life was wiped out. And yet when life came back, it came back in this completely barking, mad, riotous carnival of diversity. It wasn't just reptiles. There were lots of incredible insects that evolved in the Triassic, and some of them aren't known in any other period. And some of the earliest ancestors of flowering plants can be tentatively traced back that far. So there was a lot going on. Despite the Earth's attempt to wipe life out, life came back with a resounding raspberry to the Earth and diversified even more. So that's a long answer to your short question, which is the Triassic. I think it, as well as exemplifying a theme of the whole book, what I wanted to do with the book was didn't want to write a very traditional didactic science book. I wanted to write something that would be entertaining. So of course there are times where I skate over some things and maybe bend a few things, but most of the things are in the notes to find out what's really going on. But I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to tell like a bedtime story with cliffhangers and villains and heroes, and I wanted to make you turn the page and find out what happened next. So I wanted to have characters and thrills and adventures, because the history of life on Earth is such an amazing story. I'm amazed that more people haven't told it as a story, because it's such a rattling good story. And of course, it's still going on. And of course, I had to make it our story, because all my readers, as far as I know, will be human beings, and people do like to read about themselves. So I didn't, my PhD animal was the extinct fossil bison priscus, and the aurochs. So given that in traditional taxonomy it ends with the bovidae and the bovines at the very end, obviously the bovines are the most sophisticated and evolved creatures. I could have had a story about cows, but cows, although are very sophisticated in many ways, can't actually read except in Gary Larson cartoons, and so I made the story about ourselves. So as you see, it's kind of telescoped. It focuses in on ourselves. Like the first 9/10 of the history of life is just a foot in the first chapter, which is only about 14 pages long or so, but the last 3 or 4 chapters are really about the development of hominins from apes, and the diversity of hominins, and the rise of Homo sapiens. So it's kind of our story as well, and a little peek over to the future to show that even though we like reading about ourselves, we're just one small species in a huge continuum of species that enter the stage and say a few lines and then leave the stage again. As the late David Raup said, at a first approximation, there is no life on Earth because 99% of all species are actually extinct. So there we are. I've got that cavalcade there.
Amazing.
I've
And
run out of breath.
So as not to ruin anything for anyone, and if anyone doesn't know this at this point by now, they're not paying attention, but towards the end of the book, you paint a very true but bleak picture for the future of humanity because of things such as climate change that happened hundreds of years ago that are affecting us now. What I mean, how bleak is it in your opinion, comparatively?
It depends on the time scale on which you look. At a longer time scale, human beings are mammals, and mammals live for about 1 million years or so, and humans are no exception, and humans will become extinct. Now, human beings are, I decided not to talk about space, human expansion into space, because it's a theory of life on Earth. It's possible that human beings might break out of the Earth and live in space in colonies, but my feeling is that's not an escape route, because the colonies of humans will be very small and very far apart and like remote islands, and quite a lot of them will just become extinct because, as Jared Diamond said, it sounds like a very silly thing to say, but it's true, is there's nothing that kills a population so much as lack of people. So there are a number of things that worry me about humans. Now, coming back to the medium term from the long term, so humans will disappear within between 1,000 to 100,000 years. I mean, this is just only slightly more educated than a wild guess here. So I'd say in the low tens of thousands of years. But there are a number of reasons for this. One is humans are very, very samey genetically. I mean, amid all this, the current very valid concerns about racism and diversity and inclusion, humans are very, very, very homogeneous genetically. In there isn't any more variation in the 7 or 8 billion humans. In fact, there is less variation in 7 or 8 billion humans than there is between bands of chimpanzee in West Africa. So, and this reflects the fact that humans almost became extinct at least once, and the whole of the current population has been repopulated from a very small group of individuals. It's called the founder effect. And that leaves us vulnerable to contagion and various kinds of disaster. Another one, which I didn't mention in the book, and I'm wondering about, is sperm count in humans has collapsed disastrously in the past few decades. No one knows why, although I did think, I bet it's to do with stress. I think, you know, if you have all these people crammed together in cities, which is a very new innovation, that's not a very natural way for people to live, because people used to be, for most of the existence, very thinly distributed across the landscape. So that might be one. And another thing is that amid the current and very necessary debate about climate change, and I have to say here, despite my talk of asteroids and volcanoes and climate change in the past, I'm not one of the people that says, hey, modern climate change is just one of those things. I think human-caused climate change is a serious problem, not for the Earth. So I don't like that slogan, save the planet. The planet doesn't care whether we're here or not. It's for saving ourselves and ensuring that we humans have a tolerable existence. But beneath the climate change, there's another worry that's beginning to worry policymakers, and that is the human population it will decline soon. It's still rising now, but the rate of growth has halved since Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb in 1968. Now, back then, it was quite evident that the human population was expanding at an enormous rate. It was about 2% a year, and you know how compound interest works. That gets very quickly. But now it's down to like 1.3%. And it'll be stationary, 0%, in the 2060s, possibly. Depends on which models, which demographers use. But then we'll start to decline. It'll probably top out by the end of the century and then start to decline. And there are some projections that it will actually be less than it is now at the end of the century. This is going to cause a great deal of economic disruption. But we have one secret weapon, which at one hand is causing the population to decline, but also increasing the sum of human happiness. And that is, just within the last century, there has been something that's never occurred in the entire history of animal life, and that's the emancipation of the female sex. So for most of human evolution, women had babies as soon as they were able to have babies, and then kept on having babies until they fell down dead or stopped having babies, which was usually quite close to falling down dead. But in humans, we have the menopause, which is another great feature of human evolution. And only recently have women been able to participate in political decision-making, whether it's at the tribal or the governmental level, and have control over their own bodies. And I'm talking in a very broad strokes here. I mean, there are always going to be reverses. I mean, you know, get a bit political here in Afghanistan and Texas, for example. But but on the whole, the emancipation of women has led to incredible benefits. It's doubled the workforce. It's increased the longevity and general health and welfare of human beings. Now, even in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, it's quite clear that in 1970, only 1 in 5 people completed elementary schooling. Now it's 1 in 2, and that's over the whole world. And it could be that by 2030, everyone will complete elementary schooling. And this is all to do with the emancipation of women. So although the human race will decline, the management of it will be made less catastrophic by the involvement of emancipated women. This doesn't mean that the human race won't decline and eventually become extinct. It's the question of finding a more graceful way to do it. And of course, the other thing is we're running out of resources. We're running out of natural resources, and that's seen in the economy. I was listening to a discussion about the global economy the other day, and an economist said, you know, it's a big mystery to economists that productivity hasn't really increased anywhere in the world since the year 2000. And I thought, well, it's very easy to see why. It's because we're running out of resources, and the economic idea of continual growth is coming up against the buffers of a finite environment. And then, of course, this is the big killer, I think, is the concept of extinction debt, which I don't think really people understand. And it was published in a paper which I'm very pleased to say I shepherded to publication by Mike Hassel and colleagues. And it's the idea that you can have a dead clade walking. You can have species that look very happy and very numerous, but they've already exhausted their habitat. And this was done as a model. You know, you have species that are dominant in a habitat patch, and you have species that are dispersers. They don't like being dominated over, so they go to other habitat patches. And it turns out if you destroy a little bit of habitat, it's the dominant ones that may still be dominant for a while, but then after a time will collapse. You've already lit the fuse. And we live on one planet. We are dominant on the Earth. We consume between 25 and 40% of all net primary productivity. That's all the, you know, all the photosynthesis goes to just us through our animals and our farming and so on. So we are dominant species in one habitat patch, which is the Earth. So I wouldn't be surprised if we have already marked our card there, and we are going to collapse quite quickly and possibly suddenly, and that does worry me a bit, but probably not after our lifetimes, I would hope. But and that's related to climate change, but a different subject, and I don't think people have woken up to that.
So it's safe to say you'd think within the next 100 years, life on Earth as we know it will change drastically.
Oh yeah, I think it's going to be. There's a lot of good noises coming out of COP26, but you've got to wonder about a certain amount of greenwashing. I have to say, although I think climate change is real and human caused and is accelerating, I'm not one of the people who run about hysterically screaming about it, because there are good things that are happening, which we can talk about. But I see, you know, declarations that came out, a day or so ago saying we're going to stop deforestation by 2030. Well, I think what's going to happen is all the people who like to deforest will cut down all the trees before 2030. It's just such declarations just are a hostage to fortune. They'll make it worse, but what do I know? So I do worry about that. But there are good things that are happening, and it's not true to say that people are doing nothing. And the things that are changing are to do with the force of, it's not to do with government particularly, but it's to do with the force of them. It's to do with good old capitalist market forces. Now, there's this wonderful website which I discovered, and you know, when you've discovered something, you suddenly see references to it everywhere. It's called Our World in Data. And I started looking at per capita energy consumption, which is a good measure of how we're using resources. Now, it's still increasing over the whole world, but if you break it down and you look at the so-called developed nations, such as the US and the UK, it's actually been decreasing, and it's been decreasing since 1970. So you just have a look at the things in our everyday life. I mean, you look like a fine young fellow, and when you went to university, you had all your information on a smartphone. That's my smartphone. You can't say that's my dog on my smartphone. You know, this smartphone is great. It's got all my music on it, all my photos. I can access the entire realm of human knowledge. But when I went to university, we didn't have this thing. We used to take huge armfuls of vinyl and stereo systems, and we consumed a lot of energy, and it was very inefficient. We had light bulbs that had tungsten filaments in, which basically produced more heat than light. And now we don't have those anymore. We had aerosols that came out of the back of our fridges that made holes in the ozone layer. We don't have that anymore. And actually, that's a very good example of when governments can work together. There was the Montreal Protocol, which phased out those ozone depleting chemicals. So governments can work together. And people don't drive those enormous gas guzzling cars that they used to. You only see those in productions of Grease or Bee Gees videos, not Bee Gees, well, possibly Beach Boys videos, that's what I mean. And now everyone drives little cars, and you don't have to get under the hood anymore because they're all controlled by a computer and they hardly ever go wrong. And because of the trends in electrification, in about 10 years' time, there won't be such a thing as an internal combustion engine, which causes a great deal of the pollution that we suffer from. That was invented less than 200 years ago, in 1876. And in about 10 years' time, that'll be as antique as manual typewriters. So it's just a tiny, tiny amount in human history where we produce this, and it's all going. So change is already happening. It may be slow, but it's not true to say that people aren't doing anything. And they're doing it in small ways, and it's making a difference. That doesn't mean we can't do more, but that's why I'm not in one of the, and also I'm very British, so I tend to react rather badly to people jumping up and down hysterically. I tend to say, let's have a stiff upper lip. We did survive the Blitz here, so keep calm and carry on. So that's my prognostications about humanity, but I didn't say a great deal about it. But I tried to end on a fairly hopeful note, that although the human beings are going to become extinct at some point, that doesn't mean we can't do our best while we're here to leave the planet as we found it, if you see what I mean, and be the last person to turn off the lights.
And I think that's a point of wisdom that a lot of people neglect to see, because unfortunately a lot of people only think, of course, about themselves and their own personal interests. But when you think of Homo sapiens as a whole and our role on this planet, a lot of people also don't see that we are also animals. We belong to nature. We're part of nature. We're no different than a chimpanzee in the forest. I mean, culturally, of course we are, but as far as animals go, we're the same. And we will be gone too. And I think you're 100% right. The better we can leave things, or at least leave them as they were, that'll give life the chance to evolve its next great experiment.
Well, but I think we rely, because we are a part of the natural world, we do rely on clean water and clean air and food to eat. And we are starting to do it more sustainably and must continue to do that.
One thing I wanted to talk about, going back to more of the beginning of time and everything, was one thing that I had really heard about for the first time. I mean, I had known of it, but trace fossils. I know a lot of people do not know what those are. Can you take a moment and explain what those are and give some examples?
Yeah, when we think about fossils, we think of the remains, the actual remains, or the impressions made by the bodies of actual creatures, dinosaurs, trilobites, hominins. But trace fossils are the fossils not of the animals themselves, but of their behavior. They are track marks, burrows, a ground that's been disturbed by the activities of creatures. Now, trace fossils are really important. You could say that most of archaeology is basically a trace fossil. It actually shows you the evidence of the behavior of creatures, buildings, post holes, roads, hand axes, stone tools. But outside the hominids, it's footprints, land surfaces with trails on them, little swish marks made by the tails of dinosaurs or early tetrapods, and burrows. These are very important, particularly early in the fossil record, because burrowing, there's a whole load of burrows that appear right at the base of the Cambrian. In fact, they're used to define the base of the Cambrian. And the fossil is called Treptichnus. Now, it's a fossil not of the animal, but of the thing that, but of the burrow. The burrow has a name. It's called Treptichnus. Ichnus usually means it's a trace. But if there's a burrow, you can usually put your Hercule Poirot little grey cells to work, and a burrow implies a burrower, which means an animal with sufficient strength and internal robustness to actually make a burrow, to delve into the earth, which means it has to be something a bit more tough than a jellyfish, and it probably has fully developed muscles, and it probably has a mouth at one end and an anus at the other end and a direction of travel. So you can just get from the trace fossil some idea that it was some kind of worm-like creature. Now, a trace fossil is a bit like but it has limitations, because a trace fossil, as I say in the book, is a bit like a scene of the crime. You can, when, you know, the detective, when Columbo turns up and sees the burgled apartment, you can tell that someone's burgled it, and you can get some idea of the motivation of the burglar, because the burglar didn't touch anything except the householder's prized Picasso on the wall, so we can tell that it was probably an art thief. But we can't say how the criminal was dressed. We can't say you know, what they look like particularly. If they left a footprint, we can probably say what size shoe it took and whether it was a man or a woman, possibly. But we can't say everything, but we can tell a great deal about their behavior and motivation, even though we might not know what they look like. And that's basically a trace fossil. Dinosaur footprints leave a lot. I mean, they are very difficult to interpret, because you have to know a great deal about the behavior of the ground things are walking on. So, for example, a three-toed animal moving on soft ground, it pushes its three-toed foot in, and then it pulls it out of the soft ground, and it does it at a slightly different angle, so it might look as though it's got four toes and so on. So it requires a great deal of detective work looking at trace fossils. They're tricky things to do, trace fossils.
In relating this specifically to paleoanthropology, for example, would the Latoli footprints be trace fossils?
Yes, they would. Yes, they would. And we can tell a lot about the Latoli footprints, at least now Latoli, I mean, I'm sure you and all your listeners will know is a place in what is now Tanzania that was excavated in the early 70s by Mary Leakey, and she discovered a surface of where tracks of all kinds of animals were found, not just hominins. And it was a wonderful surface because it was a muddy, damp, it was fairly firm but damp, and volcanic ash has just rained on it. And volcanic ash is a wonderful medium for leaving a very nice trace fossil, and it basically solidifies and it gets covered in sediment. So, and you can date it, of course, directly by potassium argon or argon-argon dating. And so these fossil trackways over 3 million years old were left by creatures, and we can tell that they were bipeds, and we can tell how fast they walked, and we can also say more or less how many there were. And it's difficult to know with a trackway whether they were all happened at once, but the ash would have been in such a condition for a fairly short time so that they were close together. And I think there's a wonderful sign of a child's footprint inside an adult's footprint, which gives you a lovely picture of a child following literally in the footsteps of perhaps a parent or an older member of the group. But what it shows is that hominins, whatever they were at that time, were fully bipedal, as bipedal as you or I, which at the time was quite a revelation. Back in the early 70s.
So when you put all this together and you're looking at Earth as a whole and all of its ecosystems, its environments. What makes a species successful? What gets it to that million-year mark you were mentioning?
Gosh, I think a lot of it comes down to luck, because large-scale sudden extinction events are a lottery. Creatures can't evolve, they can't adapt to living in a world of volcanic explosions or asteroids. I mean, the asteroid happened just suddenly in a flash, and you can't evolve your way out of that. So it's largely a matter of luck. After the end Permian extinction, the most successful creature was Lystrosaurus, which was an early relative of mammals. And I'm very fond of Lystrosaurus. In the early Triassic, they were the most common animal. I mean, 9 out of 10 of all animals were Lystrosaurus. And this is because they ate anything, and they did live in burrows a lot, so they could get away from a lot of the catastrophe of what was going on. But in going into the future and looking at life as a whole, what seems to make things successful is clubbing together and dividing tasks. So after the, it makes my brain hurt even now thinking of the timescales. After the Great Oxidation Event 2.5 billion years ago, I mean, what's a billion years ago? The bacteria got together and made the eukaryotic cell, where a lot of bacteria, rather than trying to do everything themselves, pooled their resources. So the little cyanobacterium that was best at photosynthesis did photosynthesis, and the little bacterium that was good at metabolism became the mitochondria, and the little archaeon at the center, which was good at replicating DNA, became the nucleus. And what you found, if you pool your resources together, you can go further with fewer resources. In other words, it's economies of scale. So eukaryotic cells could become bigger. And then eukaryotes evolved and started to become a bit multicellular. But then there was another period of glaciation, which, like after the oxidation event, after the Great Oxidation Event, this one was consequent on the breakup of Rodinia, which was the supercontinent before Pangaea. And that caused a lot of weathering and another ice age. But that created the animals, where multicellular eukaryotes got together into a very much more organized form. And I think that this kind of increasing levels of organization seem to be important in the survival of life. The late great evolutionary theorist John Maynard Smith wrote with an absolutely brilliant Hungarian called Urs Szathmáry, wrote a book called The Major Transitions in Evolution, talking about prokaryotes to eukaryote cells, eukaryotes to multicellular. And now we're finding more and more social organization. And social organization is linked with success. There's another book by the sociobiologist Ed Wilson, which came out a couple of years ago, called The Social Conquest of Earth. And that says that the most successful animals are the social insects and humans. And it is because we have a very great social organization in which we divide our resources. Now, I can't speak for you, but certainly if I were left on a desert island with no clothes and had to fend for myself, I could probably manage it, but it wouldn't be as rich or fulfilled a life that I have now. I mean, I wouldn't be able to suddenly invent a computer connection and talk to you. So we all have our specialisms, and if the plumbing goes wrong, we get a professional in or whatever. So we all have our resources, just like worker bees and guard ants. But then when you look at it, a lot of these societies collaborate. Pollinators, when flowering plants evolved and short-circuited evolution, because rather than waiting for the wind to pollinate them, they made them attractive to insects. So plants and insects evolved together. And some of them have these mutual relationships that are so close that one can't survive without the other. So, for example, there's the fig. And what you think of as a fig is not actually a fruit. It's a little home that the fig makes with its little fig wasps that can't live without it. Now, there's another question, and I cite in the book why you don't get a mouthful of wasps when you eat a fig. But I think this kind of social organization is going to increase as time goes by. So in the 3 billion years I give you at the end, I have some speculation about how animals and plants and fungi and bacteria will eventually unite into single enormous superorganisms, using the precedents that have already happened. Plants associate with fungi all the time. Ants have this colonial organization, and anthills have distinct behavioral properties different from other anthills, the same like human nations. And all of it will basically evolve to make limited energy go further. So all the while, life is learning I use learning advisedly. It's basically a short circuit, adapting to do more with less. That's what life has always seemed to have done. And that's really what I learned with writing the book, that when faced with crises, life will learn to adapt by doing more with less, and therefore getting through whatever crisis there is at the very largest scales. It's and of course it's a bit speculative, but if there's another thing I've learned from this book is to be able to sit back and take a very, very long view of evolving life on the planet.
I bet that's definitely true. The time scales that we deal with, and I mean, I typically don't go past 7 million years, because that's when the hominids aren't there anymore. But billions of years, I just can't even to figure that out and to grasp that is just near impossible.
Yeah. Well, I've another thing I've done is I've almost completely stopped listening or watching news because it just seems so ephemeral. I just can't cope with it anymore, because I've got into this kind of Zen state where I'm thinking about millions of years. I've turned into Duke Paul and can only think of long periods, and I haven't seen. So I'm taking a kind of a long view of things, which is sometimes quite comforting, but then sometimes really scary, actually.
Right. So to kind of wrap things up a little bit, because I know at least want to go back to sleep since it's been so early because of that announcement this morning.
Yeah. Well, I'm going for my afternoon nap. Like most elderly silverbacks, I like to have a nap in the afternoon.
So to conclude, do you think on Earth, because of course there is, as you mentioned, the possibilities of life outside of Earth that we're just not getting into because that's so many more other books. Do you think humans as we know them, unless there's some drastic change in our environment, do you think there's a chance we will evolve further into something else, or do you think we're kind of plateauing?
I think there is a chance we'll evolve into something further. It basically depends on small populations being separated from other populations. So for that to happen, we'll have to have a drastic population decline and stop using air travel, and or emigrate into space and live in asteroid habitats and not necessarily planetary surfaces. And what tends to happen there is that when you get small populations that are isolated, you have, again, a founder effect. They will have a distorted sampling of the genes in the population. And that's already evolution. When you change the balance of alleles, that's already evolution happening. And so you will get creatures evolving into the Guild steersmen in the Dune universe who can only live in zero gravity because they live in spaceships and things like that. So people will evolve. It'll be very chancy because small populations tend to become more extinct. quickly because they're subject to stochastic variation. But evolution is always happening. Evolution is happening now because of contagion. I mean, I think it's very likely that evolution, well, if human beings do survive, in about 200,000 years, you'll find most people will be able to trace their descendant to one AIDS-resistant sex worker in Uganda. I mean, it really is like that. So diseases change human beings. The reason why diabetes doesn't floor Westernized populations as much as Black or Asian populations is because the former have all the diabetes genes have been weeded out by coming onto a Westernized diet hundreds of years earlier, whereas other people who used to live on quite healthy rice and fish are now dining at fast food restaurants and can't cope with the fat and sugar loading. And that evolution is happening. It's happening now. Already, you know, we see changes in the makeup of human evolution, and simply because human beings have changed the things that kill us. Now, I'm not talking about cancers and Parkinsonism and Alzheimer's, the great curses of old age. I'm talking about childhood diseases, which kill people off when they're children. That's why they're called childhood diseases. I mean, when I was a kid, measles was rife, diphtheria was rife, there was still smallpox, and there was still tuberculosis. And some of these things are reviving, partly because people have so got used to the success of vaccination, they feel that on philosophical grounds they can do without it, which I think is a grossly irresponsible view, but that's another thing. But nowadays, you know, 2 generations ago, people died of infectious disease in childhood. That's what people died of. Now people don't die of infectious disease as much. They die of accidents and extremely rare genetic disorders. Now, you switch on the TV, on the times I switch out TV, and there's always a feature about an appeal for some child who's got some disease that you've never heard of, and they can only be treated in some hospital in a foreign country, and they're trying to raise the money. And this is because in the past, these children would have died of measles or malnutrition or cholera or all these other things. And because of the medical science, which is fantastic, by the way, the things that threaten human beings are changing, and this will keep us evolving. So people do say, has human evolution stopped because of, say, our technology and the fact that people don't die of infectious diseases? No, we don't, but we die of different things, and we are still mortal, and we are having babies later, and where our life history is changing, and we eat different foods that aren't good for us and other things. So evolution can't help but happen. It's not some figure with a scythe, you know, pointing at and saying it's the salmon moose. It's evolution is just a personification for what we give to superabundance of offspring and environmental change and inherited variation. You put all those things together, as Darwin said, and evolution will happen. It's just a part of the natural order of things. So the fact that we are existing and we live in a finite population of reproducing individuals with heritable variation, evolution will happen. Of course, you don't know how it's going to go. I mean, back in the day, in the 1950s, science fiction used to portray evolving humans as enormous brains with tiny little legs, but we've no idea how things are going to go. No idea at all, which is part of the excitement and the terror of it. So
100%. And I think with that mystery, we will leave off there. I want to thank you once again and remind everyone, Dr. Henry G., author of A Very Short History of Life on Earth, out November 9th.
Yeah.
It is a wonderful and excellent book. I am being sincere when I say you will learn an amazing amount of things about life on Earth. And if you're a scientist of any type, it's just a great read. And I would just like to thank you again for coming on the show, and
You're
I
very welcome.
really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. It's good to talk. And you go back to sleep now. Yeah.
Thank you for adventuring with us into the human past. If you've enjoyed this video, check out our website at www.worldofpaleoanthropology.org and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.